let's just talk about seasonal weeds, the edible sort pretty much. Now, these are warrigal greens that I'm focusing on. They're a really good spinach substitute. You do have to cook them because they've got a higher content of oxalic acid than spinach, but even spinach has a reasonable amount of oxalic acid, so moderation is the key. In amongst there, growing as a separate weed, is chickweed. Here it is. It's a pretty little weed. It's in flower. It has a nice little, a tiny little white flower. I think it's got a bug. Oh, it's got a few bugs having a feed from it. I don't know that they were the good ones actually. Anyway, so chickweed is quite nice in a salad. You have to make sure that it is chickweed that you have and not petty spurge. Chickweed sort of grows as a sprawly sort of plant, whereas petty spurge tends to be more upright, and I can't see any here at the moment, but there is some around usually. When you actually pick some of your chickweed, there's no white sap, and the white sap is quite caustic in your petty spurge. And I don't know if I'll be able to demonstrate it or not, but when you look at chickweed, it has hairs up one side of it. I think that the camera's not going to focus on them. Up one side of the stem, oh yes, you can see it just there. And that's pretty much definitive. So no white sap, and the hairs, when you're going to use it in whatever you like to use it in, I chop it up finely and put it in salad. You do need to chop it fairly finely because it's quite stringy, otherwise it would be a bit unpleasant to eat. So that's those two weeds sitting there together. Over here, in amongst the self-sown mustard, is what's known as marshmallow. It's named, this one is a variety called Malva parvifolia, and it's everywhere. The seeds are very long-lived, survive for a long time, and any time that there's any bare ground anywhere, you are quite likely to grow a mallow because the seeds are minute, and it's always a good idea to pull them up before they actually go to seed. Now the leaves of this I use as something to soothe my throat. If you get that dry, irritating cough, I chop them up fine, mash them up a little bit, and give them a good soaking in water, boiling water. You know, leave it to meld for about 5 minutes or so, and then just sip at it. Same as anything else. If you have too much of it, it'll probably give you diarrhea. I have no idea because I've never had too much of it, but you can also use it in amongst your greens. So if you're cooking some greens up, you know, a few big leaves like that chopped up in amongst your spinach, it sort of makes, it has a very nice mouth feel. I can't think of another way to say it. It sort of fills your mouth, and it's very sort of got a silky sort of texture. Very nice. It's very nice, and if you put it in there amongst your spinach, nobody will know. So, you know, you've got sort of something free to bulk out your meal. And here we have a fine example of a mature onion weed or three-cornered leek. It's actually got a flower bud spire coming up the middle there, and it will be in flower in a couple of days. Pretty little white flowers with green dots on them, but it is a weed, and I will be pulling it out and eating it fairly soon. I don't really want it in that patch. It's totally out of place there. So let's move on to something else. In amongst my young native windbreak, I have parsley. Now, is parsley a weed or not a weed? It depends on your outlook, doesn't it? So in this area, I would classify it as a weed, but I'm quite happy to leave it there as a ground cover until I need it. A weed isn't a weed is just a plant where you don't actually want it growing, where it's inappropriate, and this parsley is probably inappropriate there. I think I've tried to grow another ground cover underneath it, but it failed, so I have parsley, and I'll try another native ground cover in the future. So then we can move on, and I can talk about the combination of those main three plants that I've talked about and making them into something delicious. So I have a very nice recipe, very simple, to use up some of nature's bounty out of the garden. And first of all, you pick a big armful of warrigal greens, and it'll sort of trim down to about, what have I got, about 600 grams, 700 maybe. Somewhere about 500 is probably enough, but 700 is fine, you just cook it. So I've trimmed all those off, and they've had a wash and they're going to be blanched. While that's happening, I'm going to wash and trim up the parsley. It's a big handful of parsley, 2 bunches of, well, they're not spring onions, they're the onion weed, 3-cornered leek, and I'll trim up the mallow, just so that I just have the leaves, because the stems are a bit tough. So I'll chop all those up finely, and after I've blanched and drained the warrigal greens, I'll fry them all up in a saucepan with a good glug of olive oil. So I'm probably talking a couple of tablespoons, maybe even more. I just cook them with the lid on. I sort of break them down a little bit with a wooden spoon. Cook them down a little bit with the lid on, and then afterwards open the lid up, and about 15 minutes of cooking with no lid on to dry the moisture out. So you can cook them as long as you like. Depends on the texture that you're after. You can drain the juice off. I just boil it away. And then you can use it just as a green, or as a filling for spanakopita and all those lovely Middle Eastern and Southern European pastries and breads. Enjoy. Here we are, ingredients all prepared. There's the warrigal greens that have blanched and disappeared down to not very much, just along with some of the mallow leaves, not blanched. A great big heap of the onion weed, and a medium-sized heap of parsley, and they are all going to go into this olive oil that is now heating. I've given everything a good stir through, and it's really nicely coated in olive oil, and I'll put the lid on and cook it for about 5 or 10 minutes. I'll see what it looks like. There we are, concentrated greens. Add salt, pepper and lemon juice if you like, and it's ready to eat. Besides regular trips onto the internet to discover what I've actually got growing in the garden, I have 3 books that I make a lot of use of. Wild Herbs of Australia and New Zealand by Tim Lowe. It's got really good descriptions of various weeds and their uses and dangers. So that's one. The second one that I probably use more is The Ultimate Gardener's Guide to Organic Weed Control by Tim Marshall. And he's also got some pretty good descriptors of weeds and long-term strategies to clear them from your garden. And my favourite book would be Weed Forager's Handbook, The Guide to Edible and Medicinal Weeds in Australia by Adam Grubb and Annie Razor Rowland. I use this book a lot for description. It's got nice coloured pictures. Oh, look at that, Malva parvifolia. That's great. And it's very descriptive. It explains what you can eat, which parts you can eat, and there's a little section on don't get it confused with these toxic weeds. I did the weed walk with them a couple of years ago, and I would say if you get the chance, once this lockdown sort of thing's over, everybody should go on a weed walk, even if you don't want to eat the weeds. At least you know what's toxic and what's not, and it's it changes your perspective to some extent as to what's useful and what's a real pest.